I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
At its core, guilt is good for us. And the reason it's good for us is because it is the signal that maybe we've done something to harm a relationship that we care about. There's nothing more important in our lives than our relationships. And so we need to keep those relationships healthy. So guilt may feel bad, but it's not a bad thing, because what guilt does is it shows that we care about our relationships.
That was Chris Moore on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoengren, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode for our co-host discussion of today's interview. Hi everyone, we're here today to unpack a complex aspect of the human experience, guilt. My guest, Dr. Chris Moore, is a professor of psychology and former dean of science at Dalhousie University in Canada, as well as a former Canada Research Chair at the University of Toronto. He holds a PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Cambridge and an MFA in creative nonfiction from the University of King's College. He has spent his career studying human social understanding and relations and has published well over 100 research papers, edited 5 books and special issues of academic journals, and authored The Development of Common Sense Psychology. He has had numerous invitations to present at academic conferences and universities around the world, and has enjoyed many research collaborations in Canada, the United States, Australia, Germany, China, and the UK. Dr. Moore's work has been cited in mainstream print publications such as Psychology Today, Today's Parent, and the New York Times. His research has also been featured in a variety of TV documentaries, including The Nature of Things and the Baby Human series on Discovery Health. Dr. Moore's new book, The Power of Guilt, Why We Feel It, and Its Surprising Ability to Heal, is his first for a general audience. He lives in Nova Scotia with his family. Welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. You know, as a clinical psychologist, I felt like I knew a lot about guilt because certainly it's something that comes up a lot in therapy and with my clients and, you know, something that I've learned about over the years. And yet I learned so much from your book. It really helped me think about some elements of guilt that I had never considered before. You unpack it so thoroughly in all these different areas of life and different aspects of guilt. And you start your book with a really powerful story from your own personal life, a profound experience that probably contributed to your interest in this particular topic.
Definitely.
Would you be willing to share a little bit about what happened and how that got you headed this direction?
Yeah, of course. So I start the book with a story that happened just at the end of my second year as an undergraduate at the University of Cambridge. And I just finished my second year exams. I decided to major in psychology. I was very excited about what the future might hold. And I and a number of my friends went to a party at the end of exams. It was a little way out of town. And we all had a little too much to drink, as often happens at these events. And we realized we were going to have trouble getting home, but there happened to be a car with the keys in the ignition in the driveway of the house where the party was. And we piled into the car, none of us being in a condition to drive. I was not driving. I was in the front passenger seat. I promptly fell asleep. And the next thing I knew, I was by the side of the road with blood streaming down my face. And I was taken to hospital. And I only learned the next morning that we'd been in an accident and we'd hit a group of cyclists who were cycling home along the same road. And a number of them had been injured and one of them had been killed. And so that was the event. And then I spent the next really week in hospital as my forehead recovered partially and had to deal with the emotional repercussions of that event.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that. There might be some elements of that story that we come back to later when we're talking about guilt and also about forgiveness.
Sure.
And also about the legal system, because you write about the human experience of guilt, but also about how society handles guilt. And so there's a lot to discuss there.
Yeah, the reason why I start the book with that story, not only was it profound in my own experience, but also it just happened to have so many different ingredients that revolved around guilt. And so, it really was sort of a perfect story for how to illustrate the variety of different ways that guilt appears in our lives.
Yes. And it seems that one of the things that happened in the aftermath of that experience was that you started reading about guilt. And I know you mentioned you read Freud, you read some classic psych research on and theory on guilt. And the first section of your book is really about what is it, why do we have it, and how it develops. But generally speaking, you take the stance that guilt is relational. What do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is that guilt is fundamentally a product of our relationships. And essentially it happens when we've done something, or at least feel that we've done something that has caused harm to a relationship with somebody that we care about. And so guilt is really the emotional response to feeling that a relationship that we care about has been harmed and perhaps is at risk of failing. So what guilt does is it motivates us to try to work on that relationship, to try to heal that relationship in some way. So it's fundamentally a product of relationships. It's not just an intrapersonal experience. It's really caused by and relevant to the relationships that we care about.
Okay, so it's not just the inner experience that we have, although that's part of it, the feeling, the emotional feeling of guilt. It's also within this context of caring about relationships and relationship.
And that's its origin. I think that's really the story that I want to tell, that guilt originates in relationship damage, relationship harm. That doesn't mean that whenever we feel guilt, there's always a relationship, an obvious relationship involved. We may feel guilty that we didn't go to the gym this morning. Okay. But in the end, all of the ways in which we feel guilt can be brought back to the relationships that are important in our lives.
Yeah, I was thinking about an example of that from my life, how I was going to fold all my laundry over the weekend and I didn't. And I was like, okay, I feel guilty about that, but it doesn't harm anyone really. I mean, it's kind of cluttering. So how would you explain that one?
Yeah. So in the book, what I try to argue is that there are different layers of guilt. So the primary layer of guilt is when we do something that directly harms a relationship that we care about. So maybe we're rude to somebody or we gossip about a friend of ours and then we feel guilty that we did that. But then there's a secondary layer of guilt, which we can call conscience. And conscience is the set of standards or norms or rules that we hold for ourselves, that when we transgress them or when we contravene them, guilt arises. And it doesn't seem at first like it's got anything to do with relationships. It seems like it's our own internalized set of norms or standards that we hold for ourselves. But the question we have to ask is, where do those set of norms or standards come from? And what I argue in the book is that their origin is in the relationships that we care about, whether it's our parental relationships or whether it's other people that we look up to, who are the originators of the set of rules that we hold for ourselves. Now, those rules may become internalized, they may become personal, but originally they have their origin in relationships that we care about. And so when we contravene our conscience, what we're actually doing is contravening the rules that were set by the people that we had relationships with in our developmental history, right? Whether it's our parents or whether it's, some other important figures in our lives, like religious figures or coaches or teachers or anybody like that. And so conscience also has its roots in relationships. It's become internalized as we develop.
Okay, so maybe I was taught along the way that having laundry folded and put away is a good thing.
Oh,
So-
and perhaps not even explicitly about laundry, but about keeping a good house, for example. And so that's the idea that conscience ultimately has its roots in the relationships that we cared about earlier in life.
Okay. Well, and my PhD was in developmental psychology as well, as was yours, before I switched into clinical. And I know that, it was an entire chapter of your book. It's a whole field of research.
Yeah.
But could you tell us a little bit about the developmental trajectory of
Sure.
how that sort of comes online? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, it is a big question, but it's a very important one. And for a lot of people, and for many years, it was assumed that children could not feel guilt or, because they were not kind of morally responsible until somewhat later in their childhood. But what we've learned from, really clever psychological research with young children is that children start to feel guilt very early in life, certainly in the preschool period. And the conditions under which they feel it is when they've done something that causes harm to another person and they understand that they're responsible for causing that harm. And then they show the manifestations of guilt that we understand. So guilt really does come online quite early in the preschool period from, let's say, 3 to 4 years of age. And then, of course, it becomes more complicated as time goes on. It becomes internalized as conscience through the middle childhood period. But that's really the developmental origins of guilt. And where it comes from is the child's natural ability to feel empathy for other people. So we see empathy in young children as early as 2 years of age. If they've done something to harm another person, then they may instinctively feel sadness for the other person. And when they come to understand that they were responsible also for causing that harm, those are the ingredients for the experience of guilt.
And if you think about it, there's some complexity to what they have to be able to do cognitively to be able to, especially over the course of time as it becomes more and more sophisticated.
Yeah, more so over time. But I think the real kind of theoretical innovation, if you like, to this work is that at the outset, it's not terribly cognitively complex. They just have to recognize that somebody else is hurt, and that leads to an empathic response. And they have to understand that they had responsibility for it. It was because of something that they'd done. And that's, of course, the original work of people like Martin Hoffman in the developmental literature. So what I like about that idea is that it shows that the feeling of guilt actually has its roots in relationships and in a basic response, an empathic response to being in relationships with other people.
And you have a chapter on the function of guilt and why we have it. And this seems to be particularly true for humans, that we're social animals and therefore we have guilt. I was very intrigued by your exploration of the non-human animals.
Right.
And my dog, my black lab, Winnie, we sometimes think she's guilty, right? We come in the house, she's been in the trash or something like that, and she's kind of hovering in the corner. Do you think that she feels guilt the same way that we experience it?
That's a great question. And it's a question that people love to think about. And whether they feel guilt or not is something that we can't actually directly assess. But I think the important point is that if you think about guilt or you kind of reassess guilt as a relational emotion, it's really a product of a monitoring of the quality of the relationship between you and your relationship partner. And then there's no reason why guilt, or at least that sort of guilt, can't be present in dogs, because dogs are very, very social. They are in a very close relationship with their owners or their pet parents, if you like. Your black lab is in a very close relationship with you. And when your lab detects that maybe you're not that happy with them for some reason, then they're going to indicate that and perhaps show signs of appeasement or, wanting to get back on your good side. And so dogs are very sensitive to the quality of the relationship. Is the relationship going well? And they will respond to it appropriately by showing these signs of appeasement and so on. Does that mean that they understood what they did was wrong? No, I don't think that they did. But what they do understand is that their relationship with you, to some extent, is at risk. And that's the key element to guilt. That's what guilt is. It's a signal that our relationship is not going great.
I mean, in the book, I was so interested in how sometimes it seems like it's more about picking up on the cues that we have, like knowing they're in trouble.
Exactly. They know that they're in trouble, but that doesn't mean they know they did something wrong. Right? There's a subtle difference between those two things. So they know that there's something wrong with the relationship, perhaps they're in trouble, but they don't know that what they did was wrong.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that I think is really intriguing as I was reading your book was to think about, and this also speaks to the function of guilt, thinking about people who seem to have an absence of guilt, particularly, psychopaths.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Like what happens when someone just doesn't seem to experience the feeling of guilt, or what's going on there?
Well, I think the idea is that, everybody falls on a spectrum of what we call guilt prone they are, how much guilt they feel. And at one extreme end of the spectrum are people like psychopaths, people who don't have those basic emotional contributors to the feeling of guilt. Guilt is really an emotional cousin of empathy. In fact, what I argue in the book is that empathy is actually part of guilt. Guilt is actually an emotional cocktail. It's not a simple emotion. It involves empathy for the other person. It involves fear or anxiety about the quality of the relationship. And it also involves an element of self-directed anger, which is really the regret for what you might have done to hurt the person that you care about. So when you combine those three emotions together, the empathic sadness for the other person, the anxiety about the state of the relationship, and the self-directed anger, that's the emotional cocktail that produces guilt. Now, we know that people with psychopathy are not empathetic, right? They do not feel empathy for other people who have been harmed. And they're also, emotionally dysregulated to a large extent. So they may not feel any anxiety about the quality of the relationship either. Right? Because they don't actually really care about the other person. And so given that, they're not going to feel any self-directed anger for what they did or any regret for what they did. And so if you put all those things together, then they're not going to feel any guilt for harming other people.
Yeah, that's interesting how with psychopaths, some might have that lack of empathy, but still follow the rules.
Yeah.
They follow the rules of society.
Yeah.
So they're not the ones you're going to find in prison or something like that.
And they may be very good at manipulating the rules too, right? So it's not that they're not socially skilled. They may be very socially skilled. They may be able to make their way very well in the world, but they don't have those emotional aspects that are needed to maintain healthy relationships.
Mm-hmm. There's a few memoirs going around lately. One about Patrice Gagne, I think is her name. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know that one, but you're right. There are a number of memoirs or first-person accounts of psychopathy, and they're very interesting. And at least to my reading, they all confirm the idea that this emotional experience in connection with relationships is missing.
When I moved into private practice about 7 years ago, one of my colleagues recommended Simple Practice. Her advice was spot on, and I've been using it ever since. Now I recommend it to anyone I talk to who's starting their own private or group practice. Simple Practice is an all-in-one EHR that is HIPAA compliant, high-trust certified, and built specifically for therapists. Simple Practice helps me streamline everything so I can spend less time on admin and more time focusing on my clients. I just send each new client a link, and then Simple Practice is my portal for consent forms, billing, appointment reminders, even my telehealth video platform. And I'm not the only POTC co-host who uses it. Emily does too, and Jill uses it to manage her group practice. If you're just starting out or growing your practice, there's also a credentialing service that takes the headache out of insurance enrollment, which will save you so much time and effort. Simple Practice is trusted by over 250,000 health and wellness professionals, and you can feel that in how thoughtfully it's built for our work. If you're ready to simplify the business side of your practice, now is the perfect time to try Simple Practice. Start with a 7-day free trial, then get 50% off your first 3 months. Just go to simplepractice.com to claim the offer. Again, that's simplepractice.com. I live in an old house in a city with pollution, and I've been worried that the air quality is making it harder to breathe. I'm so glad I have an Air Doctor air purifier in my house now. The air in my house feels better and smells fresher. I'm sleeping better and wake up feeling like I can breathe easily. And now I don't have to worry about my family breathing dust and pollution all the time. Air Doctor's powerful 3-stage filtration captures extremely small particles, about 100 times smaller than what typical air purifiers can remove. It captures airborne contaminants you definitely don't want to be breathing in, like dust, pollen, mold spores, pet dander, wildfire smoke, bacteria, viruses, odors, smoke, ozone, and VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. It's whisper quiet while it's running, not loud like other air filters on the market, and its auto mode feature ensures optimal air 24/7. You'll get reminders to change your filter so you don't need to remember or guess when to do it. Air Doctor won Newsweek's Reader's Choice Award for Best Air Purifier. Head to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code POTC to get up to $300 off today. Air Doctor comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee plus a 3-year warranty, an $84 value free. Get this exclusive podcast-only offer now at airdoctorpro.com, airdoctorpro.com, using promo code POTC.
So that's one end of the spectrum here, right? Is people who have an absence of guilt. Can we talk about the other end of that spectrum then? People who are maybe very guilt prone or shame prone as the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think it's interesting to think of it as a spectrum, because there is individual variation in the amount of guilt that people feel. So some people feel a lot of guilt and are very, what we call guilt prone. They feel guilt all the time and all kinds of situations. Whenever they're in a social relationship, they may feel a twinge of guilt. And you can think about or look at what are the sort of factors or individual difference variables that seem to predict the degree to which people are guilt prone. And there are a number. And if you think about general personality characteristics, like elements of the big 5 personality characteristics, for example, people who tend to be high on agreeableness, that is, they care a lot about making other people happy and ensuring that other people are happy all the time. They tend to feel a lot of guilt because they care a lot about their relationships, right? Keeping their relationships healthy is a very important aspect of the way they make their way in the world. And so people who are higher in agreeableness tend also to be guilt prone. And then, of course, there are sex differences. And it's a very reliable finding that women tend to experience more guilt or are more guilt prone than men are. And I think it's not that difficult to understand why that is the case. We know that women put a lot more effort in terms of their everyday lives into maintaining their relationships and trying to keep their relationships healthy. And so they have this signal, this guilt signal, that keeps motivating them to work on their relationships.
Do you think there's some socialization involved in that as well, in terms of girls and boys and that gender-based differences?
Yeah, I think there is, but I'm not really a fan of kind of socialization as an explanation, because I think it's really sort of hand waving. It doesn't explain how that happens. Are little girls taught directly to feel more guilt? I'm not sure that that's the case, right? So in order to kind of agree with the socialization explanation, I think you really need to unpack what that means. What does it mean to be socialized into guilt? But I do think that there are reliable sex differences which you can see pretty early in development, and which I think are related to the fact that girls and women tend to be more interested in keeping their relationships strong.
Now, you do also talk about certain areas of our day-to-day lives where we might be likely to experience a lot of guilt, clearly in relationships, friendships, family relationships. I'm kind of in that sandwich phase of life right now where I'm raising my kids and, my parents are aging and having some aging related things that they're dealing with. Can we start with parental guilt? Why is there so much guilt in those years of having young kids?
Yeah. So let's take one step back and say, what are the relationships that are going to tend to lead you into feeling guilt? And my answer is that they're the relationships where you have a lot of responsibility for care for the other person. So they're caring relationships, what we often call communal relationships. And they're relationships where one person has more responsibility for the care of the other, and the other one is receiving the care. And if you think about the parental relationship with a child, the parent has pretty much all of the responsibility for caring for the child. Now, on the other hand, the child is a very vulnerable person particularly when they're young, it's easy for them to get into harm. And so the parent not only has a high responsibility for care, but they also have another person in the relationship who is, let's say, at risk for being harmed. So there's a lot of responsibility there. And that is a situation which is naturally going to lead to feeling guilt, because you're the one with responsibility. And there's all this risk that whatever you do or something that you do is going to harm the other person, is going to lead to harm to the other person. And so that's why parents feel a huge amount of guilt, particularly mothers. They have this extremely strong relationship with this very vulnerable other person where they have all of the responsibility for the care of the other person. And that's a recipe for guilt right there. And so what happens is that the parent starts to feel that, anything that they do, there is a risk that they're not doing it right. And you see it a lot in the breastfeeding literature, for example. It's a huge issue in the work-family guilt issue where, moms are having to consider whether to return to work. And there is a direct conflict between perhaps the child's best interests and the parent's own interests. And so those situations are just primed for parental guilt. And that's why parents do feel a lot of guilt in terms of their role as parents.
I found that very validating to read, because it does feel sometimes like almost no matter what you do, there's going to be that question of, am I doing enough? Am I doing things right? And certainly as a therapist, I've seen so many different versions of that in my practice, where parents are just feeling constantly guilty as if they're not doing enough.
But I do feel like it can be, when you understand the reasons for it, it can be a little bit liberating as well, because then you can start to understand that, I'm going to feel guilt all the time. But ultimately, it's sort of misplaced guilt, right? Most of the time, parents are doing everything that they can in their power to do the best for their children. Okay. Does that mean it's always going to work out perfectly? Of course not. But that doesn't mean that guilt is the appropriate emotion to feel. They're doing everything that they can.
Well, as we sometimes say, it's a sign that you care. And that's a good thing, right? If you're just like, so what, that would maybe mean you didn't care. So and that's one of the messages of your book is around, the positives of guilt and how it can be a good thing if we use it appropriately.
Yeah.
And then just really quickly about caregiver guilt. So when you're, for instance, an aging parent, but it could also be another caregiver role. There's also a heavy weight, I think, to that for people. I do also a lot of work in caregiver burnout, and I've seen that too.
Exactly. And I think, the same principles apply as in parental guilt. Now you have responsibility for somebody else, for another person who's vulnerable. Let's say it's an aging parent. The aging parent now needs more care than they used to. That demand for care is falling on you as the adult child of your aging parent. And so it's very similar to the parenting situation. You have somebody else who can be hurt or harmed. You have a lot of responsibility for them. And so naturally, you're going to feel guilt. And of course, the other thing, of course, is that this is a relationship that is a very important relationship. You love your parents, you care for your parents. You care about your parents, and so you want to do the best for them. So again, all of the ingredients are there for guilt to naturally arise.
Okay, and then let's talk about guilt induction, which is also known as guilt trips. I thought this was really fascinating. What's happening? What's going on psychologically when someone is guilt tripping you?
Well, so the thing to understand about guilt tripping is to, again, perhaps take a step back and understand, of course, that relationships are a two-way street, okay? When you're in a relationship, there is a degree of symmetry to it. You care for the other person and they care for you. Now, if there is a disruption in the relationship in some way, perhaps you did something to hurt the other person, then you may feel guilty about it. And what you're going to do in reaction to that guilt is you're going to attempt some kind of reparation for the other person. An apology may be part of it, but you're going to do something for the other person in order to repair perhaps some damage or some rift in the relationship. Now, what that means, of course, is that the other person is getting a benefit from that, from you feeling guilty. And so if you have a relationship partner who perhaps enjoys getting that benefit, then what they can do is attempt to continue to make you feel guilty. In other words, don't offer the forgiveness that you want, but continue to make you feel guilty so that they can continue to reap the benefits of the reparation that you want to make in order to remove the guilt. So you can't understand guilt tripping without understanding that relationships are a two-way street. And of course, feeling guilty and apologizing for anything that you've done is a good thing. It's a relationship healing thing. But if the other person isn't willing to accept and keeps pulling for more, then of course you get the guilt tripping situation.
Do you think that that's bad for relationships if there's a lot of guilt tripping going on?
Yes, I do. I think the important thing about relationships is, particularly in symmetrical relationships like friendships and say intimate partners, romantic partners, and so on. I mean, the parent-child relationship situation is a little bit different. But if you think about symmetrical relationships, let's say friendships, they need to be equal. They need to be a two-way street, right? And ideally, if both people care about the relationship, then they should be willing to forgive each other for their transgressions. I mean, all relationships hit bumps along the way, right? There's no relationship that's perfect, whether it's an intimate relationship or a friendship. The issue is, will both partners bend towards the other when those bumps occur in order to keep the relationship healthy? All right. And if one partner consistently refuses to bend back, then that's not a healthy situation.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, it's one thing if someone occasionally drops a small guilt trip, but when that's a pattern, it just makes you aversive to the person a little bit.
Definitely. And I think it undermines the nature of the relationship because it's one person really taking advantage of the other. And so the symmetry of the relationship is lost.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned apology and forgiveness when you were talking about that. Tell us more about the importance of an apology.
Well, let me first say what's really important is the forgiveness, because if a relationship is harmed and you feel guilt because you feel bad about the relationship being harmed, then the way to heal the relationship is to receive forgiveness from the other person. So forgiveness is the antidote to guilt, right? When you feel guilt, if the other person forgives you, then the guilt dissipates. So how do you elicit forgiveness from the other person? Okay, well, what you have to do ideally is to issue an effective apology. And that is an apology that addresses all of the necessary aspects of the relationship harm that's caused. And importantly, these are sort of recognizing that the other person has been hurt in some way. And that's a product of the empathic compassion that guilt embodies. Saying that you care about the relationship, and that's really a reaction to the anxiety that you may feel about the state of the relationship, and also expressing your regret. So saying, I'm sorry for what I did. I wish I hadn't done it. I won't do it again, right? That's the more self-directed anger piece and the regret and remorse for what you did. So an effective apology sort of combines all of those pieces. And then ideally, under ideal conditions, it will elicit forgiveness from the other person. So the other person says, I accept your apology. We're good now. Okay. And that brings the relationship back to a happy or a healthy place. Right. So that's the dynamic there between guilt, apology, and forgiveness in terms of repairing relationships.
This is a place where I'd love to go back to your story and to talk about the role that forgiveness played in your ability to move forward.
Yeah. And so, the major event in that experience that convinced me of the relationship role for guilt was that when I was in the hospital after that accident and recovering from the injury, I had a number of visits from people. And they profoundly changed my experience. So one was a visit from my parents who said to me, yeah, you did a really stupid thing, but we still love you. And, that was profoundly important because part of the guilt that I was feeling is how I'd let my family down, how I'd let my parents down, right? I could accept that I'd done a stupid thing. What I couldn't accept, or what would have been very hard to accept, is that I'd lost my parents' love. And they came to me and said, we still love you. But the other visit that perhaps was even more profound in some ways was I had a visit from a set of students, one of whom had been in the group of cyclists that had been hit. He hadn't been injured. And they were all friends of the cyclist who died. these students were all members of what we called in Cambridge the Christian Union, which was the society for students who were of the Christian faith. And they came to me and said to me, it's not our role to judge, only God can judge. It's our duty to forgive. And so we forgive you for what you did. And it's very difficult to put into words how important, how meaningful that was emotionally to me, right? Because what I suddenly experienced was this kind of profound relief that they had offered that forgiveness to me. And as I, was experiencing that, it was a very sort of existential moment. And as I was experiencing that, I came to the realization, then and later on, that the emotional experience that I was having, the guilt that I was experiencing was fundamentally tied to hurting other people. And it was only going to be relieved through forgiveness.
I really appreciate you sharing that, just the profound effect that had, knowing you were still going to be loved by your parents and knowing that they were willing to forgive you. And they actually spontaneously forgave you. In your case, they came to you.
Yeah.
I imagine you might have done the apology and asked for it if they hadn't done that, but what a gift that was that they just...
Yeah, I know, just an incredible gift. And I feel so incredibly lucky. And you're right that even though I had done wrong, I was spontaneously offered forgiveness by those that I'd harmed. And that was, profoundly important. And many people don't get that. Like many people make mistakes and many people don't get the relief that comes with forgiveness. So I am profoundly grateful for that.
And I would actually like to talk a little bit too about the legal aspect of it, because you have a chapter in your book about how guilt is an experience that we have, but we also have laws around guilt, and we determine, guilty behaviors, being guilty. Yeah. And that's a whole complicated topic. In your case, you had to go through courts. Tell us a little bit about that element of things.
Yeah. So, in terms of my own story, what happened is, because we had taken a vehicle that did not belong to us, even the ones who had not been driving, so myself and the two other passengers were charged with the criminal offense of what's called taking and driving away, which is a vehicular crime. It's not stealing because there was no intention to keep the car. We were just joyriding, basically. However, it was a crime. We were prosecuted, and we actually did go to prison. We received a 6-month jail sentence, and that was, the kind of the objective, if you like, judgment that society brought down on us for what we'd done. Now, at the time, what was notable to me was that I knew that I was guilty of that crime, that there was no doubt about the matter, right? That was a fact of the matter. But I didn't actually feel guilty. I didn't feel guilty about that crime, right? Because, I knew I'd been drunk. I, got in the car on a spontaneous whim. And so I didn't feel guilt for that crime. I felt guilt for lots of other things, but not for that crime. But nevertheless, there is this whole process within our society for how we prosecute criminal guilt. And that is what I call objective guilt. It's a fact of guilt rather than a feeling of guilt. So if you break a law and you're proven to have broken the law, then you are objectively guilty of that crime. And then society has a bunch of processes that determine, what's going to happen next, sentencing and whatever comes next. And what I argue in the book is that all crimes are effectively cause relationship damage, right? Just as the feeling of guilt is in relation to relationship damage, criminal offenses are relationship damage. It's just that they happen to be relationships within society as a whole, typically not your close interpersonal or family or friend relationships, right? And so society has a set of laws or rules that determine what you cannot do in the context of relationships with other people in that society. And when you break those rules, then you are guilty of a crime. And you have to have some punishment as a result.
Yeah, and people who are interested in this should really pick up the book because you write about some cultural differences. You also get into religion and how different religions treat wrongdoings and that type of thing. Um, we also have the justice system, and you wrote in the book about how in the justice system, true forgiveness can be hard to come by because often people go through whatever, punishment that they have, but there's kind of this broken relationship.
Yeah.
Maybe not if it's a minor thing, but if it's a felony or a big deal, there's
Yeah.
kind of this broken relationship between the person who did the crime and society. Do you think there's a better way to handle this just in terms of the psychological part of things?
Yeah, I mean, this is the issue that I was trying to grapple with when writing that part of the book. I mean, the reality is that we have to have laws, particularly when we live in societies where, the people that we may be harming aren't known to us. And when the people that we're harming aren't known to us, we tend not to have the feeling of guilt so much, even if we have that we are objectively guilty. And so there have to be rules, there have to be ways of managing people who transgress those rules. But the problem with the criminal justice system is that it's very rare for true reconciliation between the person who's committed a crime and society to be achieved. So you may get handed down a sentence, maybe it's a carceral sentence, maybe it's a fine or whatever, and you do that. But in a way, you still retain the stigma of being a criminal, right? You may have a criminal record and so on. And so in a sense, you're never truly forgiven in the way that you harm somebody in an interpersonal relationship. And I think that's a problem because it means that relationships between those who've committed crimes in society always remains a little bit off balance, right? They're never restored to where they were completely. And the other problem, I think, is that, the feeling of guilt, the emotional side of guilt, often is not actually relevant to the criminal justice system, right? It doesn't actually matter whether you feel guilty when you commit a crime. What matters is, did you commit the crime? And that's why our prisons are filled with people with psychopathy, right? Because they did commit the crime. They may not feel guilty about it, but that doesn't matter. If they committed the crime, then they're guilty. But I think, one of the things that I talk about a little bit in the book is the concept of restorative justice. And the importance of restorative justice is it works to some extent, and I don't think it's perfect, but it works to some extent to reintroduce the idea of the feeling of guilt, that is the emotional side of guilt, into the criminal justice system. Because what you attempt to do in restorative justice is to analyze the web of relationships that have been harmed through the crime, and then work on how do you rebuild, how do you mend those relationships that have been harmed. And quite often that requires the person who's committed the crime to admit to the crime and meet the people who they have harmed. And that reintroduces the feeling of guilt into it. And it can be more powerful in terms of reconciling the person that's committed the crime to society.
I've read about some very powerful examples of that. I'm sure you have too. It's sort of interesting to think about that and how that could potentially be healing for all parties.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you guys know that 3 out of 4 U.S. homes have toxic chemicals in their tap water? Yikes. Even though contaminated water looks clear, it can put you at risk for a lot of health concerns. Surprisingly, standard fridge and pitcher filters do very little to remove most contaminants, and bottled water contains microplastics. So what's the solution? It's called AquaTrue, the countertop water purifier that's been tested and certified to remove 84 contaminants, including chlorine, lead, forever chemicals, and even microplastics. AquaTrue has been featured in Business Insider, Popular Science, and it was named the best countertop water filter by Good Housekeeping. I have one, and I absolutely love it for my new office. So join 98% of customers like me who say their drinking water is cleaner, safer, and healthier. Head to aquatrue.com now and get 20% off your purifier using promo code POTC. AquaTrue even comes with a 30-day best tasting water guarantee or your money back. Take the guesswork out of pure, great tasting water with this exclusive podcast-only offer now at aquatrue.com. That's AQUATRU.com. and use promo code POTC.
Running a podcast means that you're wearing a lot of hats and keeping track of a lot of to-do lists. It can be quite overwhelming. We have learned that finding the right tool can be a real game changer. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Heinz to brands just getting started. Tackle all those important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool you need. Everything is in one place, making your life easier and your business operations smoother. And what if I get stuck, you ask? Shopify is always around to share advice with their award-winning 24/7 customer support. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/POTC. Go to shopify.com/POTC. That's shopify.com/POTC.
So you also write about collective guilt, and this just seemed very timely to me with some of the major problems going on in the world these days, which is really when we feel guilt that's related to the actions of a group that we're part of. And of course, you gave some examples of the Holocaust, white guilt, even green guilt about environmental. And so what is collective guilt and what do you make of that in terms of what we can do for experiencing that?
Yeah, well, they're right. It is very timely. We see a lot of expressions of it right now. It's a very interesting phenomenon and interestingly, quite a recent phenomenon. It really only came about at the end of the Second World War with the discovery of the Holocaust. And in fact, the term collective guilt was coined by Carl Jung and Theodor Adorno at that time. And what collective guilt is the feeling of guilt. Well, let's talk about the subjective form of collective guilt first. So it's the feeling of guilt that arises when a group with whom you identify has committed some kind of atrocity or some kind of oppression of another group, even if you had no personal individual responsibility in that crime. And so the first clear expression of it was people born in Germany after the war. So the generation born after the war, let's say in the late 1940s and early 50s, who came of age in the late 1960s, had an outpouring of collective guilt, right? They felt guilty for what their nation had done to the Jews, even though they themselves individually were not alive at the time and they had no responsibility for it. So that's the idea of collective guilt. You identify with a collective or with a group, and that you feel guilty. You take on the guilt, the emotional guilt in association with what your group did to another group. Now, there is also objective collective guilt, and that is, a little bit different, but that's a group recognizing that they had guilt for doing something to another group, and then basically contravening some kind of international law. So take, for example, again, to go back to the Holocaust, the nation of Germany, or what became West Germany after the war, Second World War, admitted its collective guilt for the Holocaust, and since that time has paid reparations to the state of Israel for the crimes of the Holocaust. Okay, so that's an objective form of guilt. And many nations since, or many groups since, have also admitted collective guilt in an objective sense. So, for example, my own country here, Canada, has paid reparations to the survivors of the residential school system, Indigenous survivors of the residential school system. So that's the objective side of collective guilt. But the subjective side of collective guilt is when a member of that group feels guilty for what their group has done to another group. And a lot of people have a problem with that because they think that, you only have responsibility. You should only feel guilty if you personally were involved in it. Right. So it doesn't make any sense for a German born after the war to feel guilty for the Holocaust. It doesn't make any sense for a white person in the US today to feel guilt for the crimes of slavery. But I think, it's not that simple. And the reason is that our self-identity, who we understand ourselves to be, is not just an individual thing. It's also the set of groups or collectives that we feel a part of, whether it's our race or whether it's our gender or whether it's our nationality or our religious group or the football team we support or whatever it is. All of those collectives make up our identity. And so we're going to feel guilt about what those collectives may have done, bad things those collectives may have done to other collectives. Right? So it's complicated. The difficulty, though, is trying to figure out how to resolve collective guilt. You can resolve objective collective guilt because, you determine what the appropriate recompense is or reparation is based on what your group did. But resolving subjective collective guilt is a very difficult thing to do. And the reason is, or one reason is, let's say, is that there is no way for forgiveness ultimately to be offered by the group that was harmed, right? So there's no way out of that collective guilt. So it's certainly a common thing today, but it's also a very tricky thing to kind of work through.
Yeah, I really appreciated your chapter on that. For me, it gave me a lot to think about for a number of things happening in the world and things that have happened here in the United States where I live, and very timely for a number of reasons. So yeah, I thought that was fascinating to think about that.
Yeah.
And I want to move into the conclusion of your book because it's such a lovely note to end on, which is about making friends with guilt.
Yeah.
And you write that guilt has an image problem because, of course,
yeah,
most of us, if given the choice, would probably prefer not to feel guilty. And yet we can have a healthy relationship with guilt. What would you like to say about what guilt can teach us and how it can enhance our lives?
Yeah. So the reality is that guilt feels bad. It's a bunch of negative emotions. And so we'd rather not feel it. Okay. So guilt feels bad. But my main point is that at its core, guilt is good for us. And the reason it's good for us is because it is the signal that maybe we've done something to harm a relationship that we care about. There's nothing more important in our lives than our relationships, right? I mean, really, everything that we care about is tied up in our relationships, whether it's family or friends or, the people that we work with and so on, our communities. And so we need to keep those relationships healthy. That's what makes for a good life. But that doesn't mean that relationships are all going to be smooth sailing all the way. Sometimes, as I said, you're gonna hit a bump along the way, and so you have to have mechanisms that are going to help you get over that bump if you're going to keep your relationships healthy. And the most important mechanism is the feeling of guilt. So guilt may feel bad, but it's not a bad thing because what guilt does is it shows that we care about our relationships. It means you're a good person. And what we need to do is we need to act on our guilt and identify whether we have some responsibility for harm to a relationship that we care about. And if we do, then attempt to apologize and make reparation. And that's the way to keep our relationships healthy.
Yes. We say sometimes transforming pain into purpose.
Yeah.
And that relational component is a huge part of it. And just thinking as a therapist, if I had a client who was guilt prone or who was feeling guilty about something, my solution would never be stop feeling it. That would just not work, first of all, but also then you would miss the opportunity guilt provides. So, yeah. Well, Chris, I have really enjoyed talking with you about this. I love taking one psychological experience like guilt and just putting it under the microscope to see what we can learn about it. And this was such a fascinating conversation. And I'll again say what we talked about today was really the tip of the iceberg for your book. I learned so much. I really will keep some of these ideas with me. And so just encouraging listeners who found this interesting to take a deeper dive, check out the rest of the iceberg by reading the book. So thank you for coming on. Where can people find you online if they want to learn more about your work?
Obviously I'm an academic. I'm at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I have a website there. I have my own website at chrislmore.com, which has a little bit of information there. But yeah, check out the book, The Power of Guilt. Hopefully people will find it enjoyable.
Thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Thank you, Debbie. It's been a lot of fun.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening. I love when we take a deep dive on the podcast into one specific aspect of the human condition, and guilt is certainly a fascinating and complicated one. Emily and I are going to talk about the episode for a few minutes here, and I'll start us out by saying that to me, guilt is such a fascinating thing because I think we think of it as this negative, unpleasant experience that we don't really want to have, and yet is so universal part of the human experience. And as a therapist, I've often find that clients come into my office who are experiencing guilt about something that's happened in the past, or who maybe are guilt prone, where they're just feeling guilty all the time, even about minor things, or just carrying guilt around, which is something I have experienced myself before, where it's almost like no matter what I do, I feel guilty for all the things I'm not doing. I thought it was really helpful to think long and hard about guilt and what is its function and how can we have a good relationship with guilt. And so, Emily, I'm going to just turn it over to you because I know that you had a few thoughts about the episode as well.
Yeah. One thing that I was thinking about is how, I don't know if listeners know, but I put out a journal with Hearst Publications a couple of years ago called In Your Feels. And I devoted a chapter to guilt for kids 8 to 12 to understand how the emotion can be helpful, even if it's uncomfortable. So it was fun to listen to your discussion and think about, I included that in this like kind of basic emotional literacy tool for kids. So I wanted to give that a shout out.
That's a great resource for parents who want their kids to learn about it.
Yeah. And in fact, I had many adults look at it and say, I could use this too.
Right. Of course.
But I really was interested in the whole discussion. And one part that I thought would be good for us to keep talking about is the role of socialization. And we, have all kinds of experts on this podcast, and we have ways of really immersing ourselves in topics that are our way of approaching the world, right? And so I love Chris's full expertise on this emotion and how much work he's put into it. And I have a slightly different take on the role of socialization than what came up in the interview. And so I thought that'd be interesting for us to talk about a little bit. And I think what really stood out for me as someone who works a lot with parents is when we're talking about parental guilt, how there are absolutely gender differences in that experience that I do see as related to what is conditioned and socialized as being a good mother and embodying motherhood.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that because that's an empirical question that's hard to answer through research. And yet I think we can kind of take a look at how there might be multiple factors contributing to a gender difference there.
Right. Well, and you've lived as a woman and a mother in
yes.
this society. But, as I am very immersed in the parenting world, I see examples of this all the time. And I wanted to share one today because it really stood out to me. And it came across my Facebook feed. And it is not something I would agree with. So it's just so funny that it was just in my algorithm. But this post, which is from a soccer mom blog, interestingly enough, says, take the job that fits into your child's schedule because you can get another job, but you can't get their childhood back.
Ooh,
yeah.
Yes. Okay, yes.
How did that make you feel, Debbie?
It's a great example. Well, it makes me feel a little bit angry because, for one thing, I don't see that on soccer dads, and nor do I even think soccer dads exist because that pressure to manage this kind of thing and to join a Facebook group about it or whatever, a lot of that does fall on moms. And this idea that you're going to shape your job around the soccer schedule, maybe some people want to do that. That's fine if that's your choice. But I think that feels like pressure to me. How about you, Emily?
Right. Well, that's why I remembered it and took a screenshot of it because I felt like this is the messaging that's out there. Yeah. And even if we don't agree or it's not our opinion, it still influences our psyches when it comes to guilt because there are social expectations that may not fit our personal values, but we are absorbing them. And I think it would be interesting to look more empirically at that relationship to build on this work around guilt specifically. I think that would be fascinating.
Yeah. And one part of the book that we didn't really get into much in the interview, but that I thought was really interesting was also thinking about some of the cultural elements of guilt from things like religion and that type of thing. And he actually really did go into this in the book, and we didn't really have time to get into it. But that's another example, I think, of where we get messaging growing up that can contribute to guilt. And again, it's not a bad thing necessarily, but we do want to be aware of that, especially if we're feeling that sense of feeling guilty no matter what you do, and maybe carrying guilt in an unhelpful way. And one thing that I personally really loved in this conversation and in reading Chris's work had to do with guilt induction and guilt trips.
Yep.
And what was funny is that after reading the book and then doing the interview, I was spotting them left and right in my personal life. I was like, guilt induction. Are you guilt tripping me? What are you trying to get out of me? You know, and to the point where my family was a little bit like, okay, you know,
Settle down.
simmer down here. Like, not everything is meant to be a guilt trip. But I thought that was actually super helpful as a framework to just keep in mind. Sometimes I think we are getting a little bit of guilt induction from people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's helpful to be able to name that and to kind of be like, okay, what's going on here?
Right.
And so, you know, maybe you'll find after listening to this interview that you'll be able to spot it more easily now. So anyway, thank you, Emily. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.